Amit is actually a general partner at Owl Ventures. He's an education technology investor. And I guess, Amit Patel, you're part of the San Francisco milieu, right?
Yes, I am.
And do you want to say a few words to introduce yourself, and then I'll probably ask you a few questions?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me here today. Great to speak with all of you. I'll talk a little bit about Owl Ventures and talk a little bit about myself and kind of how I came to Owl Ventures. So Owl is a education technology focused venture capital fund. We were started in 2014. We have approximately $285 million assets under management. First fund was $100 million. Our second fund was $185 million. We invest in all aspects of education technology. So everything from early learning to K-12 to higher education to adult learning. We primarily focus on the Series A and Series B stages of companies, leading those investments. So we have 19 portfolio companies. We've led 18 out of the 19 investments that we've made. And then we selectively will look at kind of seed deals or Series C deals. Personally, I came to the education space not from the investment perspective, but actually from the operating perspective. So directly before joining the team at Owl, was the director of technology at Success Academy Charter Schools, which is a charter school network in New York City that now has 40 schools. So was a customer for a lot of these EdTech companies. Prior to that, was at Mathnasium. They do after-school math learning centers for kids, similar to Kumon and Sylvan. They have about 800 locations in the U.S. And then prior to that, ran my own tutoring company.
That's awesome. Thanks, Amit. So I guess the first question's got to be, and it may be a bit of a dumb question, but I'll ask it anyway. You know, we keep talking about EdTech, MarTech, FinTech, etc. If you could just take a quick minute to level set the audience here, what exactly are we, what do we mean when we say EdTech? So in a very quick minute, if you can sort of say what it is that EdTech does or what it is.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think, so there's a lot of definitions of this. The way that I'll answer it is kind of how our firm views education technology. And the idea behind education technology for us and what the types of companies that we're interested in investing in are ones that we believe will have a direct impact on student or learner outcomes, which means there's a variety of ways that can happen. I think when you initially hear that, you immediately jump to kind of testing or moving things online related to assessments or something like that. We think that this can be administrative technology as well, so things that principals are using or superintendents in schools are using, so not necessarily classroom-facing technologies only. It can be infrastructure plays, so we've invested in a cloud web filtering solution, something that not a teacher is necessarily going to interact with, but more likely the director of technology or CTO at a district. And then it can also be something where the technology is something that the instructor is interacting with, but not necessarily the student is interacting with. So a good example of that is a company in our portfolio called Tinkergarten, which is in the early learning space. And what they do is offer outdoor education classes for kids 18 months old to 8 years old. And so the entire class and all of the curriculum that the student is interacting with happens outdoors. The technology component is how the curriculum is distributed to the leaders that are running those classes and the marketing and kind of quality assurance that happens on the experience associated with that class.
Awesome. Thanks, Amit. So given sort of the big focus on learning outcomes and some of the administrative things you talked about, could you sort of get a little bit deeper on why is now such a great time for EdTech?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually just talking to someone kind of before this event started, and she mentioned the fact that, I was talking to other venture capital investors, and they said, EdTech, I wouldn't touch that, ever. I wouldn't ever consider really investing in that space. And that's something that we hear a lot, and we're actually kind of happy about. Kind of the goal of venture capital is you want to be right and non-consensus driven, right? So we're happy the fact that kind of for right now at least, we're not seeing a whole lot of competition. So why now, I think, matters, or the answer is different across all four of those sectors that I was talking about, meaning early learning, K-12, higher ed, and adult learning. I'll specifically go into, for example, why now in the K-12 sector. So if you go back even 7 years ago and you look at kind of the actual infrastructure that was in place for EdTech, it wasn't very encouraging, meaning less than 10% of K-12 schools around the country had access to high-speed broadband internet. When you're talking about devices in K-12 schools, it's usually a computer lab, which means students are interacting with those devices maybe once a week for an hour at the most. And you fast forward to today, more than 80% of schools, US K-12 schools now have access to high-speed broadband internet. And with devices like the Google Chromebook out there, basically the amount of students that now have access to one-to-one devices is north of 50%. And we feel that kind of within the next 5 years, both of those statistics will become close to 100%. And so if you were an ed tech entrepreneur trying to start a company 7 years ago, it was very difficult. You were either selling a software that had to get installed on a local server or into some type of computer lab device or something like that, versus now you can actually deliver a cloud-based software service, and you're actually having grounds up adoption of these products.
That's great. So in fact, Richard later is going to talk about some of the infrastructure aspects of how these things get delivered over the cloud. I was going to say, given that this is sort of a good inflection point, as you talked about in terms of investments in ed tech, could you maybe paint a picture of sort of the broader landscape? And you can pick any one, K-12 or higher ed. What might be some of the trends that we are looking at now that people are investing in or looking out into the future?
Yeah, so one, I think that it relates a lot to what Coursera is doing, and some of the companies that we're actually investing in is this concept of lifelong learning, right? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that the idea that education kind of ends after your undergraduate degree or graduate degree is starting to become less and less of a reality, right? I was recently speaking to a class from Stanford, and it was specifically the computer science undergrad program there, and they were discussing how kind of whatever language that they're learning to code in kind of upon graduation almost becomes irrelevant 5 years after graduation. And this is arguably one of the top computer science programs in the world. And so if someone graduating from that program is having to reskill and relearn what they're doing 5 years after they're graduating, you can only imagine kind of how quickly things are changing for students that are graduating from other programs. And so the idea that you will have to continue that education is something that we believe in and we have invested in. So an example of that is a company in our portfolio called Thinkful, which is in the kind of online computer coding sector. So this is built for adults who are looking to make the transition to a computer coding career. And so they can take this course online 6 months, and then after that they can kind of make the transition to becoming a developer. Some of the things that are interesting, I think, particularly about Thinkful, is the curriculum's asynchronous. So you're not quitting your job, you're not moving somewhere. You can do this at your own convenience. You can do this part-time. The second thing is we've coupled this with one-to-one interactions. And so this is another trend, I think, that's important in the EdTech sector. So 2 to 3 times a week, students that are completing that program are actually interacting with a software developer one-on-one. And on average, that software developer has been working for 10 plus years. So as they're getting stuck in the curriculum, as they have questions or things like that, they get the benefit of that one-to-one interaction. And so that's something that we think is actually tremendously helpful. And so what I'll talk about is this concept called Bloom's Two Sigma theory, if some of you are familiar with this, which talks about the fact that if you look at traditional classroom teaching methods and how a student will perform when they're receiving those types of teaching methods, and then you compare that to, many of you probably have heard of this personalized learning or adaptive learning, there's a certain amount of improvement that happens because you're delivering not a one-size-fits-all curriculum, but something that's tailored to that specific student. Now, if you compare that to this one-to-one interaction that Thinkful is offering, you actually see 2 standard deviations improvement on average student performance compared to traditional teaching methodologies. Kind of the issue with delivering this one-to-one methodology in the past has been cost, right? And you're really limited to the fact that it's the radius around which that teacher and student kind of live around each other, because most of this was delivered in person, right? So now with technology and with platforms like Thinkful, you're able to have a developer that lives in the Bay Area kind of matched up with a student that might live in Atlanta or something like that, and kind of match those students and teachers together. And we're seeing that happen not only in the adult learning space, but we have another company in the K-12 space that is called Better Lesson. They're offering this for teacher professional development. So K-12 teachers are getting paired with coaches one-on-one that they're interacting with, and the coach might live in Texas and the teacher might be in Massachusetts. And so this is something that we're seeing leverage not only in adult education, but also in other areas.
That's pretty awesome. So it looks like across the spectrum, both in K-12 and in higher ed, there are companies and innovations happening that sort of give you this one-to-one match between supply and demand, if you will, where I might need to have the instruction or the coaching or training, and then someone in some corner of the world can give it to me on demand, potentially, right? So it's sort of seems like a marketplace kind of an idea in a sense. From there, I'd like to sort of have you extend a little bit and talk about this whole concept of adaptive learning, because that seems to be a big buzzword going on now for the last 5 or 6 years. And it's one-to-one, one-to-many. It's all about how do you tailor the instruction to the specific needs of the individual and their learning styles. And for me particularly, it's an exciting time for someone to be in the adaptive learning space, not just because of all the data analytics and the predictive analytics that's going on, but this whole new buzz about artificial intelligence. So if you now have a fusion of AI, machine learning, with content, I think there's some great things that are possible in the future. Maybe you can prognosticate on where that's going?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, if you talk about buzzwords in the EdTech space right now, adaptive learning is certainly one of them. Personalized learning is one of them. I think others that I'm seeing in kind of company presentations include machine learning or AI. Blockchain is even starting to get thrown in there. So, and you probably know this, you were at Pearson before, and it's something that a lot of companies will claim, but not a lot of companies are actually able to deliver on, right? And so adaptive learning is something that has tremendous benefit to the student, but is actually difficult, I think, to truly execute on. So there is a company in our portfolio that has been doing adaptive learning. So it's a company called Dreambox. They're in the K through 8 supplementary math space. And they do have an adaptive program, and their program in particular collects close to 50,000 data points per hour on each student to deliver this personalized program. And one of the reasons why we know why it works is because they've actually done an efficacy study on the platform. So last year, in partnership with Harvard, they actually did an efficacy study where they showed that using Dreambox actually improves student scores on the NWEA MAP assessment, which is one of the leading assessments used around the country to measure students' performance and progress when it comes to math education. And not only that, but greater usage of Dreambox actually resulted in greater scores on that MAP assessment. So I think that's an example of a company that's actually doing that type of adaptive learning. A lot of times, adaptive learning is simply just, if you get this question right or wrong, we're going to give you the kind of same kind of question again, and that's not adaptive. When it comes to like AI and AR and VR, that's something that a lot of folks are talking about right now. I think those technologies particularly are interesting when it comes to certain sectors of EdTech. Where it's not going to be necessarily applicable in the near term, I would imagine, is K-12, for example. Schools right now are struggling to afford things like, textbooks and things like that, right? So the idea that all of a sudden they're going to have enough of a budget to spend for the Oculus or something like that is, difficult to imagine. So I don't imagine that that's going to happen in the short term. Where I do think AR and VR could be interesting, and I have seen interesting applications for it, is there's a company in the Bay Area called Z Space, which is doing something interesting there. And what they're focusing on is, nursing students or students in other healthcare-related professions, using technology like AR to start to understand how the body works. So you're not just reading about a heart, but you're actually seeing a heart in augmented reality. You can go inside it, see how the blood flows, see how the different chambers flow and things like that. And I think in that situation it actually makes sense because the cost of a student spending time in the lab learning that is actually more expensive than what it is if you actually buy all of this equipment and allow them to interact with these concepts via AR. So if you're talking about situations like that, I think there's some exciting things that are happening in the near term.
It's pretty cool. So you mentioned a couple of things in terms of trends. One of them is lifelong learning, and we're going to hear from Richard pretty soon on what Coursera is doing to advance that. We talked about adaptive learning a little bit, and you mentioned the AR, VR challenges. Are there any other sort of burgeoning trends that you can see now that are going to significantly alter the landscape? In other words, if you look out 10 years from now, what will the world of education look like compared to what it is today? I know it's a little bit of futuristic thinking, but if you could just spend a couple of minutes on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few things. So one is this idea that I already touched on, which is lifelong learning, right? So I think starting from we're beginning to understand more and more about how kind of the human brain works, how we're starting to pick up vocabulary words, how we're starting to understand language and things like that. So the more we start to learn that, I think when I'm talking about lifelong learning, it's going to be starting from when a child's born all the way, cradle to the grave type of concept. And so, one area that we have seen a tremendous amount of underinvestment in is early learning, right? So if you look at all of the research in, the graduate schools of education, the area where you get the biggest return for your investment is in early learning. And what do I mean by that? It's, if a student is not reading on grade level by the time they're in third grade, they're actually statistically unlikely to ever catch up and be reading on grade level. And so this is something that is actually a very, kind of scary statistic to be aware of. So the more that we can do, not just K through 3, but actually, 0 through 5, I think the better our students are going to be. So I think we're going to actually see a lot of companies come up in that space once we start to understand how folks will learn. I think the second thing is this gig economy. Kind of Uber and Lyft and some of these other folks right now are taking advantage of that. But as we're noticing trends with millennials and younger generations, folks are just starting to prefer that type of work arrangement, right? They want to be able to work from anywhere. They want to be able to, work for 3 months, maybe take 3 months off. So I think designing companies that will allow folks to arrange their life in that way, to create a family in that way, and support their lifestyle in that way is going to be important. And so I think we're going to see EdTech companies that move beyond just teaching like the basic fundamentals of math and literacy, but actually, how do you create the type of life that you want? Like, what is it that you need to do in order to create that. So that's something that I think is going to be particularly interesting as well.
That's pretty awesome, and it's a good segue to my next question, Amit, which is, given the gig economy and given the way that people want to consume content and learning at their own time, at their own pace, etc., and then you look at the investments in the last 5 years. I think you and I were chatting recently, and you said it went from like $1 billion a year about 5 years ago to almost over $5 billion a year now. So there's a ton of money going into the space. And I get the feeling that, maybe we're getting a little just too crowded in this space, right? And so with all the innovations going on in terms of, you pick out like the top 4 or 5 things that are dramatically going to alter education in the future. And then you got these hundreds and hundreds of startups. And I don't think you mentioned a few of your portfolio companies, but would you care to comment on, is it getting to be too crowded a space? How do companies start to differentiate themselves? And then sort of part B to the question is, are the successful ones going to get swallowed up by the likes of Pearson, etc.?
Yeah. So I don't think we're actually anywhere near kind of being overcrowded in the space. So, and one of the reasons why is, so if you look at the education sector as a whole, it's a $6 trillion industry, right? So it's the second largest industry after healthcare. Currently, depending on what report you look at, less than 2%, or some cases less than 1% of that spend is actually on digital. If you look at other mature sectors, it's actually closer to 30 to 50% is being spent on digital. So there's a lot of room to grow there. There's a lot of room for digital to kind of continue to grow and new companies to get started in the space. So I think we're actually at the kind of, first pitch of the first inning when it comes to education technology. With regards to your second question is, do these companies get purchased by the likes of Pearson? I think that'd be great. Anytime you have kind of large acquirers or dependable and consistent acquirers in the space, the more entrepreneurs that get attracted to that, the more investors that get attracted to that, because, as we're making these investments, one of the obvious questions that we're asking is, what is the path to liquidity here? And having publishers or the incumbents like Pearson, McGraw, HMH start to become more active again, I think would be fantastic for the space. I think other folks that have been active and have been inquisitive about the space include some new entrants. So big tech is certainly one of those, right? Amazon purchased one of our companies in the past. Amazon purchased 10 Marks, which was a supplementary math curriculum program. They've now started making that one of the kind of centerpieces of their education strategy. Google, as I mentioned, is very focused on sales of Google Chromebooks in the space. And then Microsoft has been doing a lot of kind of investment when it comes to single sign-on for students. They just announced a partnership with PowerSchool, which is one of the leading student information systems out there. All of these companies are also starting to do a lot of investment when it comes to cloud-based infrastructure for these districts. They want to make sure that kind of they're using Microsoft products. Kind of when you think about it from the big tech companies' perspectives, this is in the K-12 space, that's the first time a lot of these students are getting introduced to their operating systems and their platforms and their technologies. And so they have a very vested interest to make sure that they are kind of contributing to the K-12 EdTech sector. I think a third group, which is really interesting and very, very new, is these Chinese EdTech companies. So last year, there were 4 Chinese EdTech companies that all went public and listed on the US stock market. We have a few others that are already starting to list for this year or in the process for this year. And most recently, there was a $200 million Series E round for another Chinese EdTech company. And so a significant amount of that funding that you're talking about and that increase has been going into these Chinese EdTech companies.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And so language is not a barrier then for them?
Yeah, it is not, and I think there's a few reasons why some of these companies are interested in specifically listing on the U.S. and then potentially increasing activity here. One is I think there's real interest in an appetite for students or parents in China for their students to be taught by US-based teachers. I think there's a very willingness for that type of education, that type of offering, especially when it comes to English language learning. That is something that they are very interested in. And I think second, there's a real interest in the innovation that's happening here. Some of the most innovative companies, not only in the EdTech sector, but in all sectors, are born in the US. And so I think they recognize that and they want to partner with those companies or acquire those companies. And then finally, there's an interest in kind of diversifying their business as well, not just to be dependent on the Chinese education market.
So outside of the US and China, are you seeing any big innovations coming elsewhere in the world? Are you making any investments yourself?
So of the 19 investments, all 19 so far have been in the US. We are interested in international opportunities and we are continuing to evaluate them. We have not made one yet, but we are excited and hopeful that we will soon. I recently went to this conference in Dubai, the Global Education and Skills Forum, specifically to start to meet with more international education technology companies and start to understand what's going on internationally more. I think it's interesting things are happening everywhere. In India, there was a recent company called Baiju, which has received a significant amount of funding. The Chan Zuckerberg initiative out here is actually one of the major investors in them. So I think there's a tremendous amount of interest in the Indian education technology space. So that's one area where we've continued to meet with companies itself. A second area is South America. Kind of one of the phenomenons that's happening in South America is there's a increasing, college age group or generation that's coming up. And even if all of them wanted to go to college or could get admitted to college, there's not enough university seats out there for all of them. And so there's a lot of interesting kind of lifelong learning education technology efforts that are underway in countries like Brazil, because the existing system or the traditional system can't actually support everyone that is interested in getting a college degree. And so we're seeing a lot of interesting things happen there. And then kind of Africa, if you look at kind of the statistics out there, the biggest population when it comes to college age going students is actually going to be in Africa in the next few years. And there is a lot of interesting activity that's happening over there. Andela is one of the companies that many of you might have heard of, which is in the computer software development space, where they're actually helping young people in Africa learn how to become software developers by having them work with and intern with US-based technology companies. So it's kind of a win-win for everyone involved in that process, because the students in Africa are getting paid for their education. They're not having to pay for it because they're working starting from day one. And companies in America are getting access to high quality talent at a lower cost than it might be in the US itself. And so they've started to create this, nice virtuous cycle with that company there.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. So, hey, Amit, we could go on all day long with this. I'm actually enjoying myself in sort of reliving my edu past, if you will. So listen, I'll tell you what, and I apologize for sort of hogging the stage here, but I think we should probably give 10 minutes for those of you that have questions for Amit. So fire away.
What are some of the most interesting companies you've seen in the adult learning area?
Yeah, so mentioned Thinkful already. That's one. I'll talk about a second one that's in our portfolio that runs on a similar type of theme, this idea of one-to-one. So it's a company called Lingo Live. They're focused on the language and communication coaching sector. And so what Lingo Live does is they actually work with a lot of the leading technology companies here in the Valley. And as these companies are starting to become global companies, they're having to hire folks from all over the world, India and China and everywhere, in particular for the engineering positions. And a lot of the engineers might be non-native English speakers. And, kind of if you are not confident or fluent in your communication speaking abilities, it can limit kind of how high you can rise, especially beyond like an individual contributor type of level. And so what Lingo Live does is they've created an online platform, and they have one-to-one coaching that they offer to employees, and employees will meet with this language coach 2 to 3 times a week for 45 minutes for each session for about 6 months, and they improve their communication and language skills that way.
So with what the work that Khan Academy is doing today, all the programs are everything that the students learn is free. So what I see is a lot of school teachers are using Khan Academy as an after-school learning platform for students because they don't have to subscribe to some program. How is that affecting the education that these entrepreneurs, these small companies are trying to start, which is on a paid program? What is your thought on that?
Yeah, so the essence of the question was, how is Khan Academy kind of impacting the ability for new EdTech content companies kind of starting, and what impact is it having? So I think, so first of all, I love what Khan Academy is doing and what Sal has created there. I think, kind of if you look at before Khan Academy came into existence, a lot of people would consider education technology just taking worksheets, putting them online, and now that's EdTech, right? But no, that's not the case. And I think what Khan Academy did was show us what high quality EdTech actually looks like. And if they're offering that for free, if you're actually charging students and schools for something, you better be offering something with a lot higher quality and a lot higher value than just putting worksheets online. I think there is always going to be room for premium content or paid content, especially when it comes to companies that are delivering timely content. So a good example of that is another company in our portfolio called Newsela or Newsela. What they've done is they've created partnerships with some of the largest media publishers out there, and they take articles from them on a daily basis and they rewrite them at multiple reading levels so that teachers can contextualize what's going on in the real world with what they're teaching in class, right? So, these are very serious topics, such as, like, for example, the shooting that happened in Florida recently. This is a topic that students are going to hear about, they're going to want to talk about, but not everyone can read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever to understand that. And so Newsela offers a way for teachers to bring that content to their students, discuss it, and help them understand it, right? Or it could also be like kind of fun topics like Black Panther, right? Like, this is a movie that came out that showed minorities as well as underrepresented minorities as well as female characters and roles that they might not typically be seen in. And so teachers can talk about that and teach that. And so that's not something that I would say is going to become, free to create, or there's going to be no cost associated with creating that. So that's why I think a premium content company like that can continue to exist.
This is going to be our last question. So, fortunately. Okay, 2 more it is.
Okay, I understand that the VC way of funding the EdTech companies, I'm worried about the bubble. What you didn't talk about how you're solving the eventual revenue and profit problem in EdTech.
Yeah, so I think that's a good criticism of kind of, if you look at historical EdTech investments, a lot of them have been trying to leverage, let's say, consumer internet technology investment trends. This idea of, don't worry about the revenue model, let's get a lot of users on our platform, and then we're going to figure out how to monetize those users at some later point in time. I think especially when it comes to K-12, the 2 typical ways that you monetize users is illegal in K-12. So the first way is you kind of advertise against that user base. Whenever you're dealing with a population that's, very young, you can't do that. The second is reselling that data, and that's also illegal in the K-12 space. So when we are making an investment, our companies are already at some type of significantly scaled revenue, or within 12 months, we expect them to have some type of significantly scaled revenue. I think in the K-12 sector specifically, that's why we're attracted to the business models that are actually selling to schools or districts, because if this is something that's actually part of their budget and part of something that they're actually willing to pay for, then that's something that's actually showing tremendous value. I would say some of the companies that we're actually getting access to are actually profitable at the time of investment. So that's not common, but we are starting to see EdTech companies do that. And I think if you tried to invest in these companies, let's say 10 years ago, that would have been an issue in terms of scaling revenues. But now we're starting to see companies that we invest at the Series A or the Series B stage, and they're actually able to attract growth investors for either their Series B or Series C stage, because they're able to show on a P&L basis that they're actually performing quite well.